The popular Chinese dish chop suey was actually invented in San Francisco, California. It did not originate in China. Chinese people to this day largely wouldn't know what it is. It's served in Chinese restaurants around the world, but not much in China. Yet we call it Chinese food. By calling something Chinese does not make it Chinese. In fact, it's American. Calling something Palestinian does not make it ethnically Palestinian. Let's understand what Palestine and Palestinian really is. It's an anthropological term, it's a geographical term, and it's a theological term. Let's begin as an anthropological term. What is an ethnic Palestinian? Palestine is simply the Latinization of Philistine by the Romans in the 2nd century. The Philistinim, Palestinian. The Romans, after the Second Jewish Revolt, renamed the area between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Palestine after the ancient Philistines, who by that time had long disappeared. The Philistines were not an Arab people, they were an Indo-European people from Crete. We know this by the archaeological digs in Heraklion and Crete, comparing them with archaeological finds in the Gaza Strip. Their god was the fish god Dagon. They were a Greek people. They worshipped Greek idols. They had a Greek culture. They were not in any sense Arab. These were the original Palestinians, the true Palestinians. An ethnic Palestinian has not existed in 2,500 years at least. There has not been a Palestinian on the face of the earth in any ethnic sense. Then we have it as a theological term. There have been books written by scholars with whom I myself do not even agree theologically, such as E.P. Sanders, who authored books such as Christ and Palestinian Judaism or Paul and Palestinian Judaism. Jewish and Christian theology came from that region between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. That is true. That is the theological origins historically of both Judaism and Christianity. As a theological term, we have Palestinian theology, which is Judeo-Christian. Islamic theology came from Arabia in its origin. Its ontogeny was Arabian, and it developed through the Middle Ages in Egypt. Islam is not theologically a Palestinian religion the way Judaism and Christianity are. It is a simple fact. Any Islamic scholar knows that. Then we have Palestine as a geographical description. Again, largely the area between the Jordan Basin and the Mediterranean. Prior to the establishment of the Jewish state, the re-establishment of the Jewish state by the United Nations in 1948, the region was called Palestine and had been for some time, but only as a geographical term. A Palestinian was not an Arab in any sense. There were 30,000 plus Jewish soldiers who fought in the British Army in the Royal Palestine Legion. That was on their patch. Every one of them was a Jew. The original name of the Jerusalem Post, Israel's English language newspaper, was the Palestine Post. The original name of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra was the Palestine Symphony. A Palestinian was someone of any ethnic or religious background who lived there. Mainly Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They were all Palestinians. However, something has since happened. We have people claiming a Palestinian identity that was in fact not their own claim, but was imposed on them for political considerations by their leaders in the 1960s and 70s. They are not ethnic Palestinians. They are not European, they are Arab. Their ancestors originated in Arabia, and most of the people today calling themselves or are being called Palestinian are in fact the descendants of immigrants who came to the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean often illegally during the British Mandate and during the Jewish Aliyah for a higher standard of living under the British and Jews than was available in the surrounding Arab world. They came from Tunisia. They came from Egypt. They came from Arabia. Yasser Arafat was born in Egypt, educated in Egypt, and served in the Egyptian army. There was land owned by absentee Arab landlords, but there was no state or people called Palestinian. A Palestinian was anybody who lived in the geographical region, be they Jew, Arab, Christian, otherwise. Yet something happens. In 1970s, people in the West Bank of the Jordan went to sleep. They went to sleep that night being Jordanians. Who said they were Jordanians? In 1970 and in 1968, Yasser Arafat said, Palestine is Jordan. Only when he attempted to take over Jordan from the Hashemite Bedouin kingdom of King Hussein in Black September of 1970, the British armed and equipped Jordanian Legion systematically massacred between 15 and 18,000 of Yasser Arafat's so-called Palestinian followers in 12 days in Black September. Tens of thousands more were driven into refugee camps in Lebanon by the Jordanians, not by the Israelis. They didn't come from the West Bank, they came from Jordan. Gary Burge doesn't tell you that. Stephen Sizer doesn't tell you that. Colin Chapman doesn't tell you that. Philip Church doesn't tell you that. Historical documents tell you that. Not only did Yasser Arafat say that Jordan was Palestine, but so did His Majesty King Hussein of Jordan, who I met when I was 15 years old in Virginia in America. Nice man. He said Jordan is Palestine. So did King Faisal of Iraq, who was deposed by Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, say Israel was for the Jews. King Musharraf, who was deposed by the House of Saud in the jihad in Saudi Arabia, establishing Saudi Arabia, said Israel is for the Jews. Many Arabs and many Bedouins supported the Jewish Aliyah. There was no claim of Palestinian identity, ethnicity, anthropological identity, statehood. There was no such thing. Jordan was Palestine. Arafat said so. Palestine was Jordan. The Jordanian government said so. King Hussein said so. They said so themselves. But they went to bed in 1970, and all of a sudden, a fairy appeared with a magic wand and waved it over the heads and beds of the sleeping people of Judea and Samaria, and they woke up, and lo and behold, when they went to bed, they were Jordanians. They dreamed they were in a magical cocoon, and they came out as Palestinians. What a miracle. How did that happen? The fact of the matter is that from May of 1948 until June of 1967, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights were all firmly in the hands of Arab Muslim rulers. Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza were all in the hands of Arab Muslims. If they wanted a second Palestinian state, in addition to the one that they themselves already said existed in Jordan, why did they not simply create one when they had nearly 20 years to do so? Nobody would have stopped them. Abdul Nasser, Gamal Abdul Nasser of Egypt, kept the Gazans in subhuman poverty. What happened to Palestinian nationalists, if there was such a thing, under the Jordanians? They wouldn't have lasted very long. Look at Black September. Tens of thousands of these people driven into refugee camps from Jordan. And now the world blames Israel for something that happened in Jordan? Not that I blame King Hussein. He knew what Arafat was, and he was right to protect himself and his country from that man. But they didn't come from Israel. The myth of the Palestinian refugee. They're not Palestinians. They're Jordanians. And most of them came from Jordan, not the West Bank. Israel was forced to conquer the West Bank in 1967. They didn't want that war. They didn't want the war in 1948. They agreed to the UN partition. Look at the facts. It is audio documented recordings in Arabic of the United Arab Command telling the Arab population of Israel to leave, to flee, because the United Arab Command and its armies were going to push the Jews into the sea. Then they would return once the Jews were pushed out. Only they did not bank on losing the war, because they had the numbers and they had the arms, much of it provided by the British. The Jews were simply largely refugees or kibbutz farmers or Holocaust survivors. No one thought they would have won, but they did. And they won without much international support from anybody, including America. It didn't exist at that time, but they won anyway. Now, all of a sudden, the aggressor becomes the victim. You drove us out. No, you left. Initially, the Israeli government told them not to leave, beseeched them to stay and make peace. But we're told the lie over and over and over. Open revisionism. When you see a revisionist, somebody who rewrites history, like Philip Church, or Gary Burge, or Stephen Sizer, or Colin Chapman, there's only two viable possibilities. Either they are academic frauds, pseudo-scholars, or they are religious liars. I'm not judging them or their motives. Whether they are academic frauds or religious liars or both, I will let someone else decide. I'm only dealing with what they say. It is demonstrable revisionism. They have rewritten history. They are propagating something that is utterly and totally false, at odds with the documented records. They had 20 years to make a Palestinian Arab Muslim state if they wanted one, but they didn't. They could have had peace. They rejected it. The Israelis did not want those wars. They were forced to fight in self-defense. But let's go further. The suffering of the Palestinian people, we are told. Despite the hypocrisy and corruption of the United Nations, perhaps there's a bit more honor to be found in the statistics of the World Health Organization. Under the Israelis, following the Six-Day War of 1967, the standard of living of Gaza Strip Arabs in everything from reduced infant mortality to extended longevity to improved employment conditions against the endemic unemployment that had always been there, their standards of living, their life expectancy, the life expectancy of their children, health care, their plight economically, sociologically, and medically improved, according to the World Health Organization, by 370% under the Israelis compared to what it was under Islamic governments. The West Bank improved by 320%. What Palestinian suffering? The billions of dollars and euros given to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza and the West Bank before Hamas took over Gaza was not simply misappropriated and misallocated. It was embezzled, swindled by Yasser Arafat and his cohorts. They took money given for economic development, for building an infrastructure, for improving the standard of living, and they stole the money. That is why so many of the people turned to Hamas, the corruption of their own leaders. Yet we're supposed to believe the Israelis are responsible for their poverty and suffering. Then Hamas, of course, expropriated whatever it could for military purposes. We are repeatedly told, land for peace, land for peace, land for peace. Israel gave back the Sinai after 1956 under pressure from the American Eisenhower administration. That same land was used to attack Israel by a Soviet-orchestrated attempted invasion in 1967. Now with the Muslim Brotherhood reascending in Egypt, if the military loses control in Egypt, there'll be a war again. Certainly the threat of it. When Israel was forced to invade southern Lebanon to stop not simply the persecution of Christians, but to stop the bombarding of Galilee with Katyusha rockets, they returned the land unilaterally. Syria and Iran rushed in with more Katyusha rockets. In 2006, thousands and thousands of more fell on the cities of northern Israel, including Haifa, including Arab villages, killing Arabs as well as Jews. That was land for peace. We saw what happened when Israel gave up land for peace. The Bush administration and others pressured Israel to leave Gaza unilaterally. It did. The next day, Katyushas fell on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Hamas openly admits it does not believe in peace, it believes in hudna, the Islamic doctrine of a temporary ceasefire until you can get the strategic advantage to continue the jihad. When they speak in English, they say peace. When they speak in Arabic, they say hudna, not salim. In fact, what they're really saying in the riots and the demonstrations is first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. First we will kill the Jews, then we will kill the Christians. Stephen Sizer doesn't tell you that. Hank Hanegraaff doesn't tell you that. Colin Chapman doesn't tell you that. The unspeakable plight of Christians throughout the Arab and Muslim world. The first thing that Hamas did was close the Christian bookshops in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority closed the Christian TV station in Bethlehem. They've made demands even on Catholic sites in Nazareth, and now the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem is under threat from demands to expand an Islamic cemetery. Why is it that the Sabia movement and people like Sizer and people like Tony Campola, these anti-Israel evangelicals, align themselves with non-evangelicals or with purely political evangelicals like Alex Awad, whose debate with me you can watch on YouTube? As you can see, he doesn't do very well on the basis of scripture or of fact. Why? Will they align themselves with people who are like that and not pay attention to the voices of pro-Zionist Arab Christians? Why won't they listen to Joseph Farah of WorldNet Daily? Why won't they listen to Walid Shubat? Why won't they listen to Shmuel Edrin Said? Why won't they listen to the Arabs who thank God there's at least one country in the Middle East where Arab Christians are not persecuted for their faith? What happens to the Coptic Christians in Egypt? What happened to the Phalangist Christians in Lebanon? What is happening to the Christians in Syria as we speak? What happens to Christians in Saudi Arabia, to say nothing of Iran and other Islamic countries in the Middle East? As a Christian, as a believer in Jesus, I thank God at least one nation in the Middle East protects the human rights and religious freedom of my Arab Christian brothers. That is Israel. Genocide, 3.5 million exterminated by radical Islam in Sudan and Darfur. The world hardly said a word. When Europe turned its back on the plight of the Christian population in Lebanon, it was Israel who took those Maronite Catholic refugees. The plight of evangelicals is even worse in Islamic countries. as a believer in Jesus, I thank God there is at least one country in the Middle East that protects the human rights and religious freedom of my Arab Christian brothers, and that is Israel. Thank God for the Jews, because the Muslim nations kill them. Oh, you will see nominal Christians with some kind of a political agenda. They think perhaps if the West Bank goes back into Islamic control, they want to court favor. Before that happens, they're acting out of fear. All of these factors come into play. But the fact of the matter is, find me one nation, Hank Hanegraaff. Find me one nation, Gary Burge. Find me one nation, Stephen Sizer. Find me one nation, Philip Church. Find me one nation in the Middle East where Christians are not persecuted other than Israel. You can't find one because they don't exist. Hypocritically, with the mark of a true coward, you turn your back on the plight of your persecuted brethren and embrace the cause of their persecutors. And you do so in defiance of the plain teaching of both the Old and New Testament. Again, Jesus made it clear the Jews would return to Israel 3 times, not counting the book of Revelation. Jesus himself. Luke 21:24, Matthew 23:39, Zechariah 12:1-10. Read it. Your argument is not with me. Your argument is with him. Take it up with him. I simply believe what he said. Quite evidently, you gentlemen do not. Palestine? Palestine? A Palestinian has not existed in over 2,500 years in any ethnic or anthropological or genetic sense of the word. They were Jordanians. They were Gazans. But they were not ethnic Palestinians. This year, 2012, a leader of Hamas admitted that they came from Arabia. Admitted it themselves. They know it. Why don't you, Mr. Burge? Why don't you know it, Mr. Sizer? Or why will you not at least have the courage and integrity to debate me on the basis of historical, anthropological, archaeological, and theological fact? Let's understand these issues. Palestine, Palestinian. First it was Canaanite and it was Israelite according to the book of Genesis. The indigenous people were the Israelites. Canaanites are long gone. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were there when the Canaanites were there. The archaeological record verifies the Jewish presence being continuous. Whenever it was interrupted, it was restored. Yes, Israel, until 721 BC, was there, but with the Assyrian captivity, it disappeared and it became Samaria. Until 585 BC, it was an Israelite presence in Judea. Then came the Babylonians. 70 years later, who comes back? The Israelites, just as God said. It comes under the control of the Persians, who gave them a virtual independence. Then it comes under the control eventually of the Seleucid Greeks. But with the Maccabees, as Daniel predicted, they're gone. It's back in the hands of the Jews through the Hasmonean period. Then it comes into the hands of the Romans. But for a 2-year period, it's back in the hands of the Jews, then the Romans again, then the Byzantines, then for a brief season the Arabs, then the Ottomans, the Crusades, Turks again, then the British. None of them have ever lasted. The only nation that has ever continued to return and reestablish itself is the indigenous people, the Israelites, just as the scriptures promised. That is a fact. No Palestinian nation has ever existed except the one that they themselves say is Palestine. Jordan. That is what King Hussein of Jordan the father of King Abdullah, said. That is what Yasser Arafat said. Once again, they had 20 years to make a second Palestinian Arab Muslim state in addition to the one they said they already had, and they saw no need for it. Hypocrisy, revisionism, and absurdity. That's what it is, and that's all it is. Come debate me, Mr. Sizer. Debate me, Mr. Church. Debate me, Hank Hanegraaff. Debate me, Gary Burge. I guarantee you will lose. Not because I am more clever or more eloquent, but because the Word of God is true. Because facts are facts, and you are deluded by what is demonstrably pure, unadulterated propaganda, Islamic propaganda, and utter rubbish. That's what you believe, and that is what you are being used, animated, to try to influence others to believe. The gauntlet is down. Bring your argument. I'll bring the facts. I'll see you at the podium of debate.